Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Jordan SAVOLD. I am a Global Market Access Associate at Janssen Pharmaceuticals and an MPH MBA candidate at Johns Hopkins University. And today I'll be sharing with you all the research and findings from my project, Alzheimer's in the Community, Improving Health Equity and Access to Healthcare in Racially Diverse Populations. The primary objectives of this project were to explore evidence of racial disparities in Alzheimer's disease, examine the social and economic costs of these disparities, and provide recommendations to Janssen Pharmaceuticals to advance racial equity in Alzheimer's diagnostics and treatment. Our methodology consisted of 2 streams of data collection, a literature review of over 40 articles, and 20 key informant interviews with a diverse group of internal and external experts. Now I'd like to briefly highlight a few key findings from my research regarding barriers and access to medicine, as well as tangible best practices for improving access to medicine amongst diverse populations. Data shows that Black Americans are twice as likely as white Americans to have Alzheimer's as a result of differences in lived experience. However, when it comes to receiving care and participation in clinical trials, Black Americans are excluded, making up just 5% of clinical trial participants. A few top barriers in clinical trial participation and access to medicine include factors such as socioeconomic status, stigma and cultural norms, and general awareness and education around the disease. On the other hand, tangible best practices that industry can implement to address these barriers and improve access include building relationships in communities, creating culturally competent educational materials to share in communities, empowering leaders and organizations, and improving policy. A key takeaway here is that as industry demonstrates an investment in the well-being of populations, they become increasingly valued and trusted members of community. This was a key theme I heard in speaking with stakeholders and experts as something that is currently missing in Alzheimer's intervention. Experts explain that the most impactful thing that industry can do to begin improving equity in Alzheimer's is to become more involved members of community. Therefore, to properly address these profound racial disparities, action must occur at all levels of the socio-ecological model. However, the pharmaceutical industry has a very important role to play in this process, and there are 3 key areas where industry has the responsibility and opportunity to act to address racial disparities in Alzheimer's diagnostics and treatment. These areas include clinical trials, policy, and market access. So this brings us to the recommendations. As I mentioned, they fall into 3 categories. Recommendations to advance racial equity through clinical trials include developing corporate initiatives or programs to sustainably commit to increasing diversity in clinical trials and begin investing in communities of color. Developing new internal standards and expectations around clinical trials. And finally, enhancing partnerships with the internal teams dedicated to diversity and inclusion to create and improve program-level strategies. Recommendations to advance racial equity and market access include reimagining the purpose of different therapeutics to allow for increased risk reduction in vulnerable groups, assessing the value and costs of products in the context of the populations that need them most, and finally, advocating for increased payer engagement and health equity. Last, recommendations to advance racial equity and policy include empowering and funding community organizations that can support education on Alzheimer's, destigmatization, and also support in the clinical trial recruitment and site development process. Conducting landscape assessments of current policy to better understand policy that may successfully advance or unintentionally impede DEI efforts. Partnering with other industry leaders to inform key stakeholders and policymakers on racial inequities and solutions moving forward. And finally, conducting research to better understand which stakeholders are ultimately absorbing the costs to allow for improved resource allocation and investment decisions. Moving forward to achieve racial equity in Alzheimer's, solutions must engage, support, and be implemented at all levels of the socio-ecological model, and the pharmaceutical industry can be a leader in this process by taking action in initiatives related to clinical trials, market access, and policy. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.